record on this computer. Okay, and like you say, it should give me a file option where to place that. It didn't give me a file option. I wonder where it put it. I know there is a Zoom file I know on the computer, so I'll need to go try to find that once this session is completed. As far as you know, you can't record both to the cloud and to the computer at the same time.
I once it gives an option, I do not suspect so.
Okay. All right, well, we'll do that. We'll hope that this is going to my computer. It says I'm recording top. And let's see, in my manage participants box, I have a red dot by my name, and it's blinking. So I think that does indicate that that is recording to my computer. Good. We'll get the all the little nuances of this program soon as we continue to work with it. But it does have some nice features that we are all learning about. All right. Let me just ask you if there's any general questions about the course right now before I kind of get into some of the content for the day. I noticed that you are all seeming to be participating in the discussions, and I appreciate that. I do apologize that I have not given you any feedback on discussions. I've been a little laid up this week with some oral surgery. I had a tooth out. It was infected, and then it got what they call a dry socket, so I've had a little bit of tooth pain. So today is the first day I'm really kind of functioning a little better. So I'll try not to get too animated so that I don't disturb anything in there in my mouth. All right, go ahead, Matt. I see your hand.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you, yes.
Great. So I noticed that in our assignments for this week, we skipped over several sections of chapter 1 of our project.
Yes.
Is that something we'll come back to in the course, or do we just need to do those on our own?
I want you to do those on your own. Generally, students, you can do it anytime during the course, or you can wait until you have gone through the course, and then when you're putting together the final paper, you can work on those other few sections at your leisure. I'll mention a few of those in a moment, though, just so that we're all together on those areas, just so that we all know what that's all about. Audrey, make sure you turn on your microphone, Audrey. There you go.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon, where I am. Good afternoon, class. I am facing a little crisis, Dr. Payne. I realize as I do the readings around my research area that it's beginning to change. I am having a little crisis about whether or not I am to make that adjustment from here on, or I should maintain the original statement. For example, I started out intending to look at the crisis facing women as widows and the children as orphans in the era of HIV/AIDS, but I am finding that information is so much and that each area could be looked at individually. So I'm now wanting to tweak my study to focus on children as orphans. How do I capture that? Should I maintain the original statement? Advise me, please.
No, you should probably go ahead and change that. You're submitting your template online each week. If you'll just put a note to me, say if you're going to you're working on the context chapter this week, you could just put a note to me that you have changed that problem statement, and then you will have changed the purpose statement to coincide with that problem statement. And so you could just make a note to me, and then I'll just go back and look at that problem statement and give you some more feedback on that if I think that's needed as I'm looking at your context chapter. Does that make sense?
Great. Thank you so much. That makes quite a bit of sense. I'll send you the email soon.
Okay, that'll work out well.
Thank you much.
Okay. Any other quick questions that we can answer? All right. Let me see. I'm going to do one thing here and see if I can bring up the template of the dissertation proposal. Let me see, where are you? Documents. Interesting. I'll be right with you, just looking for a particular file. Let's see. Oh, here we go, templates. And project proposal. Here we go. Okay, let's see now if I lower that. Okay, hold on here a second. Let me see if I can share my screen now. And click on the proposal template. Okay. You should you're all seeing that, hopefully. But in the proposal template, this particular one happens to be the APA template, and the Turabian is very similar. And you've got your statement of the problem, you've got the statement of the purpose. Defining key words, let's just talk about that a moment. Sometimes in a project, you may have some words that are, used quite often in the dissertation. And you may be using that word in a unique way, or maybe you're using it, but it's just a very important word. For example, just the word, say, transformation. We use the word transformation a lot at BGU, but you may want to just, define that word for your reader if you're thinking your audience may not be totally familiar on the way we use that term. So again, when you fill that out, generally you put the word in italics. We might say the term transformation, and we'd put transformation in italics, has a very specific meaning in the context of holistic ministry. And then you'd go on to maybe give a definition from BGU or whatever it might be. And then you keep going on. You might have another word that is, you probably wouldn't use the word transformation. You probably wouldn't necessarily use the word any of the 8 perspectives, because we've got shalom leadership, we have reflective leadership, we have contextual leadership, and those terms will get defined a little later here in this introduction chapter. But again, you may not need to use this section, but again, and I'll try to give you some feedback, when at the end of the course when you fill in some of those sections. But sometimes people put in their DMIN and DTL. Those aren't the kind of terms that you need to use in that area. It's just very specific terms that maybe are very unique to your particular project. Is usually how you do that. The audience, of course, you just described. Who do you think would be some of the major audiences that you would want to read your dissertation? You may be working with a church, you may be working with an organization, there may be some community leaders that you would like to read your dissertation. And so you'd list some of those folks in the audience section. And again, make sure when you're working through these sections that you use complete sentences. For example, when it says audience, don't just make a list, Mayor John Smith, Attorney Mary Jones. Put in whole sentences and try to indicate why you think that particular person or group of persons would be appropriate people to be reading your dissertation. Stakeholders, sometimes audiences and stakeholders, there may be a crossover there. So you might even just say, some of the people that I've mentioned in my audience section are also stakeholders in this dissertation. But there may be some other people that may not necessarily read your dissertation, but you would also list them under the stakeholder area. You may have consulted some experts in your area, in your community, that are stakeholders because they're contributing something to your dissertation project. There may be certain funders, people who are helping fund aspects of your project. They may or may not be part of the audience, but they are people that are contributing, in some financial way to your project. So stakeholders are just some of those folks that have some kind of, as it says, a vested interest in the project. And then we get into this section called Integration with Various Dimensions of Transformational Leadership. We have 8 perspectives of transformational leadership that we talk about here at BGU. And again, we just want maybe a paragraph or so, that talks about how you think your particular project is relating to, say, servant leadership or contextual leadership or incarnational leadership. How do you see those particular leadership principles being displayed, implemented through your project? Now, you may or may not be talking about all 8. There may be some specific ones of those perspectives that you believe are very germane to your particular topic. And that's fine. If you you may say, all 8 perspectives will have some bearing on the project, but these 3 perspectives seem to have more relevance to the kind of work that I'm doing. The scope and limitations just simply talks about issues that may be limiting to your particular project. I think you were just mentioning, I think, Audrey, that you got into your topic and you realize how big it is. And so you may want to, qualify it. And you may be qualifying it. Say you were working in I had a project last semester, somebody was doing some stuff on studies of adolescence and some trauma issues. But this particular person was working just in an all-girls school. So, the limitation in her particular project is she wasn't dealing with males, she was only dealing with females. So that was a, part of the scope of a particular dissertation project. So generally, there'll be something you can say in that section to talk about the scope of your project. Because as it says, you can't necessarily address the topic from every conceivable angle, but you maybe have a particular focus that you're looking at. And there again, you can do some things in these sections, and then if you turn it in to me, sometime during the weeks of the class, I'll give you some feedback then. If you don't, fill in these other sections until the end of the course. When you turn in the paper, that's fine, and I'll give you some feedback there so that you have the necessary kinds of content that will be useful to your supervisor and then to the academic cabinet, who will need to look at your proposal once you've completed it for this course. And then your supervisor will probably have some input onto the proposal that he or she will want to see that you include, and then the academic cabinet, when it gets submitted to them, may have some additional input for you. So those are that's kind of the process that we use in terms of going through some of the approval of a particular project. Any questions on that issue? Or we keep moving on. Okay. Again, feel free to email me if you have questions along the way. We try to answer those emails fairly quickly as they come in. Well, I want to just talk about a few concepts today. I gave you a couple of handouts just so you don't have to be hurriedly taking notes. You can just put some notes on the papers that I did give you. But before we get into the literature review, which is what you're going to do next week, I want to just kind of talk in a general way about the concept of critical thinking. And let me turn on my share screen again here. And let's see, I think it's this one here. Yeah. We've been talking quite a bit in some of our faculty meetings over the last 6 months about the concept of critical thinking. A lot of us, come into a school like BGU, and you're writing papers, and you're going to be writing a dissertation. We have to face up to the fact that even though many of us have come through undergraduate work and even graduate work, we haven't always grasped the idea of critical thinking. And so we've been talking quite a bit about that issue, like I said, as a faculty, how we can help each other utilize some of those critical thinking skills a little more effectively within our writing and the various kinds of work that we do at this doctoral level. I just found one definition of critical thinking. We'll just use the abbreviation CT as we're talking about this. Paul and Elder, in their book, Critical Thinking Concepts and Tools, defines critical thinking as the art of analyzing and evaluating thinking with a view to improving it, commitment to be aware of our own egocentrism and sociocentrism. Well, that's kind of a mouthful. But what we're trying to do, we're looking at our own way of thinking and reasoning about issues. And we need to learn more about that kind of process if we are going to be effective communicators. They give us two words there, trying to be aware of our own egocentrism, and because that phrase simply refers to the fact that we all have a particular worldview. We all have a particular set of beliefs and assumptions by which we approach life and issues that we work with. And it's human nature to think our way is right. And we understand that. Here in America, we've got the Conservative Party, and we have the Liberal Party, we have the Democratic Party, we have the Republican Party, and in your own particular countries, you've probably got your own set of political viewpoints. When we get into a particular viewpoint, we tend to interpret everything else from that viewpoint, and it makes it very difficult to talk to someone who has a totally different viewpoint. And so part of our work as critical thinkers is learning to understand our own biases and what our worldview is and how that may affect what we agree or disagree with. The term sociocentrism is similar, but it specifically refers to the fact that each of us come from a particular culture, a social background. I live here in the United States, and I live in a particular I lived in the northwest part of the United States. Of course, I grew up in California. All of that background gave me a particular set of thoughts and beliefs and assumptions that not everyone is going to share. And of course, then when we start mixing cultures from various countries and backgrounds, that particular issue becomes even more pronounced. And so we need to be, in critical thinking, we're trying to become aware of how we approach issues and becoming aware of our own, we'll call them biases. A bias isn't necessarily bad, okay, because it's something that you have acquired, but you need to be aware of it, I think is the main issue, okay? So enough of that. We've already talked about the concept of scholar practitioner. I had you read a paper for the first session, and hopefully we'll kind of keep that particular phrase in mind as we're working on our projects. I just wanted to break that concept into the two parts of it. A practitioner, all of us pretty much here at BGU, you as students and we as faculty are practitioners. Most of us are not professional academicians. It doesn't mean some of us aren't. I've been working in academic circles for at least 20 years. But, I've been a pastor of a church for most of my life too. So, I come at life I come from my professional background as from a pastoral background. All of you are going to have a particular practitioner viewpoint. But here at BGU, we have really emphasized the fact of transformation, the fact that we are all change agents, whether we're in organizations or communities or cultures, wherever it may be, practitioners are working on transformational kinds of endeavors in various settings. The term scholar then, of course, brings out the other part of that phrase that we're using. A scholar uses good critical thinking skills to communicate. And of course, that's what we're going to be focusing on very specifically in the dissertation, the final project, like I said, because we're not all accustomed to using good critical thinking skills, because sometimes we have just not learned that throughout our background, our educational background, and that's okay. We understand that. And again, even our cultures will make a big difference in terms of how well we have been schooled in the art of critical thinking. There's a concept that some of you who maybe have been in education may have heard of. It's called Bloom's taxonomy, okay? And Bloom was writing back in the early 50s and wrote a lot about education. And there was quite a few conferences on education that were participated in by various people from, here in the United States and other countries. But based on those conferences, there were 6 principles that were talked about that are considered part of critical thinking skills. And let's just talk about that for a moment here. And the idea is these are kind of hierarchical. In other words, we start at a basic level, and then we move on down to higher levels of thinking. Now, the first level is just called recall, that, I learn a set of facts and concepts. And, I may memorize those for tests. A lot of us done that through our high school levels and even undergraduate. And that's fine. That's where knowledge has to start, is learning facts. One thing I did, I looked at a study from a university of Lorraine. I always say that wrong, in Nigeria. Any of you from that area would be able to say the pronunciation better. But there was a study done from 1990 to 2009 on faculty learning objectives in this particular university. And so what I did here on this table is on the right column, I showed what percentage of learning objectives that were put together for courses were utilizing a particular skill on Bloom's taxonomy. So in terms of recall, at least with this particular university, the number of learning objectives that dealt with just remembering facts was 31%. 31% of the learning objectives dealt with learning facts. The next level up is called comprehending, and this is where we begin to interpret the meaning of facts. We may compare one concept to another concept. There's, say, 2 leadership concepts. There's a concept called servant leadership, one of our 8 perspectives. There's a concept called transformational leadership. I just read, I think I may have put it as an example in our course, a whole doctoral dissertation, I think it's at the doctoral level, that compared those 2 concepts, servant leadership and transformational leadership, and saw that there were some distinctions in the way those terms are used and how they're practiced within organizations. Well, comprehending is this whole idea of beginning to interpret and compare facts and concepts in a way that it's a little higher thinking than just memorizing the facts. Well, again, in this particular university, 56.9% of the learning objectives dealt with some form of interpreting the meaning of facts, comprehending them, in a certain way. Interesting application is when we use knowledge to solve problems. And of course, we as practitioners that should be of particular interest to us. That's why I say in our book reviews for any course, we would always want you to have an application section, right? We don't want you just to know the theory or to even be able to compare one concept to another or one fact to another, but we want to have you begin to tell us and you begin to think through how you're actually going to apply some of those concepts that you've learned to real life situations. Now, I was kind of amazed in this particular university, only 4% of the learning objectives dealt with application. There was more focus on the facts and interpreting those facts and those concepts, more emphasis on that than applying the facts. But we've got to learn to apply those facts in an effective manner. Analysis, again, we keep going up the scale here. We keep organizing facts and concepts and even applications so that we begin to see how the facts, how they fit together. We've put together, at BGU, we put together the concept of transformational leadership. And under that, we began to organize some various types of leadership that we see talked about in the Bible. And so, we talk about servant leadership, shalom leadership, reflective leadership, incarnational leadership, there are 8 of them. We begin to see how those parts fit together, various nuances of leadership and how they fit together. So that's kind of the analysis. These last 3 terms get fairly close, but synthesis means using knowledge to create a model or a plan. We could also just talk about the transformational leadership model as a synthesis also, if you will, when we bring it together into a model. When you're working in your dissertation, you may be working on a particular set of thoughts. One of my supervisees that I'm working with right now, she's working on the idea of, she's working in India, putting together some, working with children in a holistic manner. And based on her research, she's put together a model she calls domain analysis, which is a whole process to help teachers see their students, interview their students, and begin to understand them emotionally, physically, culturally. And she has about 5 different categories that she has determined that she is putting together this model for her dissertation. So, synthesis is when we begin to, actually develop a whole model based on the kind of research we've done with facts and concepts and interpreting and solving problems and seeing how all the pieces fit together. And we eventually maybe synthesize that into a full working model that becomes our model that we may utilize in various contexts. And then finally, there's the concept of evaluation. And that's where we, again, just determine the validity, the quality of the information or the plan or the model or whatever it happens to be. You kind of see, again, the percentages there on the side have dwindled quite significantly from when we started with the first 2 sets. So sometimes, even at the educational levels, we've not helped students develop some of these skills. And we're even seeing as BGU faculty that we've been guilty of just letting sometimes course papers just pass through without trying to help the student think about his or her own style of thinking and communicating that thinking in writing. And so we're working on this as a faculty. And so, this is the first time I've actually included this particular set of critical thinking skills into this course so that we might think about it, a little more as we are working on our projects. Okay, let's go to this next slide. This one you should be familiar with because you've been doing some reading, hopefully, if you've got the book. Actually, I think we had a PDF file too of The Craft of Research by Wayne Booth. And this is really a model of using critical thinking. And I really am going to be encouraging you and probably giving you comments to this effect when you're turning your writing into me, that I see some of these kinds of writing skills being demonstrated when you are giving me your writing. And if you've read through these, you could maybe just think about them a bit. Just maybe so that I'm not doing all the talking here. Somebody kind of give me kind of a definition of a claim. What is a claim, basically? As you think about your reading. Anybody want to take a guess at that one?
I guess a claim is just something that you would say you believe this is truth, or that you believe this is the reality that you observe.
Right.
So it's kind of your I guess your hypothesis or your theoretical statement that you hope will come back and give some backing up to it afterwards.
Absolutely. Okay, good, Jim. Yeah, that's exactly it. I gave just an example from Wayne Booth's writing there, but the emancipation of Russian peasants was an empty gesture. Okay, this is someone's making a claim, right? They're stating an assertion, okay? And that's a claim, and that's fine. Okay, we put that forth. Number two, though, is reason. Again, what's a reason? Pretty much can just get it from the word, but somebody just kind of put that out there. What's a reason?
It's explaining why you have arrived at that claim. You're justifying your claim.
Okay, there you go. Right. That's a good word. We're justifying our claim based on a reason. And we may have several reasons, and that's fine. But again, in one of the examples that Dr. Booth gave, the emancipation of Russian peasants was an empty gesture. Why? Because it did not improve the material quality of their daily lives. Okay, that was a reason given for that particular claim. I added a third item here, evidence. I put, Smith, and I'm using APA here, 2002, who's, an author, collected actual accounts from Russian peasant families describing their life before and after the emancipation. Okay, this would be one form of evidence, okay? And of course, I've documented that. I've put down, Smith, 2002, and probably what I'd want to do, I would go on to do a little more writing about what Smith discovered based on his collecting actual accounts from these Russian peasant families to describe life before and after this particular emancipation event. So I've given evidence, and usually I want more than one evidence. There may be another author that I can quote that has some thoughts on that. There may be some statistical information that has been gathered. Depending on the country, the level of gathering of statistics may be high and it may be low. Here in the United States, of course, we've got whole bureaus of statistics. We have census bureaus that collect census data every 10 years. And so it's become fairly a sophisticated art here in the United States anyway, to collect data. And so if there was some data on the quality of life, say among Russian peasants and during a particular period of time, gathered through some Russian statistical agencies, then again, that would become more part of the evidence that we would maybe put down to support our claim, as we started with the emancipation of the presence of being an empty gesture. So that's those first three issues that should really, I should be able to see that pattern in your writing. An area that often is neglected, I find, in dissertations papers and even in book reviews is opposing claims. Sometimes we're hesitant to put down, or we don't even realize or know that there are opposing claims to this issue. Somebody else may make the point that because of the emancipation of Russian peasants, many new entrepreneurial businesses began to form. And this person may have, a whole different viewpoint that he or she is going to bring to the table. And that person would then need to we would need to show some evidence from that particular perspective. So again, in our dissertation writing, we want to also bring in some opposing claims. Even in your literature review and in your reference list or your bibliography, there should be evidence that you have looked at some literature that actually gives opposing views to what you're stating. And again, that's the more difficult, because we get back down to what we said earlier, our egocentrism and our sociocentrism. We tend to read and gravitate toward those writings and models that are in line with what we already know. But, we have to challenge ourselves to always be looking at an issue from various perspectives. So it's important to, bring forth those claims, give opposing claims. And then a principle or a warrant, I think it can also be called, is just kind of connecting, why the reasons or the evidence connect to this particular claim. Wayne Booth gives some, different thoughts in his book, gives examples of that. One, I can't say it exactly, but I remember one illustration he gave was something to the effect that global warming has greatly increased disease. And a person may say, well, what do those two things have to do with each other? So the warrant would somehow connect those two, and he showed in that particular example that, if we're lacking hard freezes, that can be related to how many insects are killed during a winter or a hard freeze time. If we have what we call a mild winter, and the insects are not killed as much, we may have more mosquito infestations, which again would then contribute to the spread of disease. So, the warrant would be talking about how the claim and the reasons hook together to show that there's some logicalness to how those flow together. So anyway, that next slide just kind of shows, those different things that we've just talked about. So again, make sure that you've gone over that material in Wayne Booth's book, and that you become, that you start to really think about the way you write, especially in a dissertation. And like I often tell you in comments and students, dissertation writing is somewhat different than most of us are accustomed to. I've given hundreds of sermons in my life, and I've taught hundreds of Bible lessons in small groups, etc. And some of you have done that, and some of you have given seminars in business settings. Sometimes we will put out claims without too much in terms of evidence. We may just make claims, and we just expect our reader to just take that for granted. And in dissertation writing, everything has to be backed up. You can't just be putting out your own opinions unless it's common knowledge. And of course, that gets down to a bit of subjectivity. What is common knowledge and what is not common knowledge? Even when we get into the area of plagiarism, I think there's a plagiarism quiz that you have to take sometime during your coursework, and that gets into what can you rightly put forth as common knowledge, and what is really not common knowledge, but is the specific opinion of one author or a set of authors that you need to document. So we'll talk more about that, but let's look at an example here. This is an example from a student paper. It says the current status of equipping needs of the community leaders and stakeholders also further solidifies the need for a resource to complete to compel them to a holistic approach that is beckoning the systematic change that is now at a critical need. The systems and methods that are typically created and initiated carry remedies for treating symptomatic issues for children. However, they lack clarity for transformative thriving in the life of every child, and hence the community of children, and truly impacting an entire community. Advocates are eager to find an aligned and threaded approach that addresses the hit or miss methods that yield limited change only. Okay. That was given there, but what needs to be added to that? What do you see in terms of that paragraph? What's the claims, and what kinds of evidence? Where is maybe reasoning or evidence present or lacking? You know, you're just reading this for the first time, and it's a rather complex paragraph. But what do you see there? What's the claim to start with?
I think the claim seems to be there's not a holistic approach to the equipping needs that's going on, and it seems to be that's the main claim they're making in all the sentences there.
Okay.
But they're not. He's not giving, at least from this right here. There's no basis where he's saying that. He's just making the claim that there's a that they're just treating symptoms. They're doing hit or miss, but they're not really looking at the holistic view.
Right. Okay. You know, and I put my comment down there, what I made of this. You need documentation to back up some of the statements that you make in this paragraph. Okay. Let's take one of those in there. This person would say, let me find one. Right down in the bottom, let's take the last sentence of that. Advocates are eager to find an aligned and threaded approach that addresses the hit or miss methods that yield limited change only. Okay, now what I told that student, that's a bit of a generalization because that's his or her opinion. How could a person maybe begin to document that statement? What kind of evidence can you think of that possibly this person could look for to begin to bring in some reasons, some documentation, some evidence for these claims?
So he talks about advocates that are eager to find this approach.
Right.
Maybe those advocates have written about that need and he could quote them.
There you go. That would be great. What's another way that you could possibly give some evidence in terms of those advocates? You could look at their writing. What could you do in your own research?
Yeah, you could interview some of them to see, you know, how happy they are with current approaches.
There you go. Right.
Change.
Yeah. So what should be stated here, say if this was in the problem statement, we might want to put some kind of a general documentation that shows that, and again, this may be difficult to find, but there may be writers who are making this statement, that some of the work that is being done with children is not actually looking at them from a holistic point of view, and that, you know, practitioners in that field are involved in working out models that will begin to approach children in a more holistic manner. There again, in the problem statement, we'd need to find at least one or two authors that seem to agree with the claim that's being made here. And then it could be stated that, you know, in this project, I am going to be doing more interviewing with advocates, child advocates, to possibly substantiate this claim a little more thoroughly. So yeah, you kind of get the thought here, hopefully, is that, you know, when you're looking at your writing, you're doing this kind of work, okay? This same kind of thing, I say in this particular one, the first two sentences of this paragraph are generalizations. Currently, the understanding of children as the viable agents of change in societies and cultures is a burgeoning idea. However, the way in which global cultures evoke and enact human rights advocacy for children is wide and varied and is represented with a spectrum of marginalization and oppression to the advanced holistic understanding that allows for a compassion advocacy initiatives that transform. First of all, that sentence is a little long. Sometimes when we get into academics, we think we have to write long, what I call Pauline sentences. And I tell people, you know, just because you're writing in academics doesn't mean that you have to give me long, convoluted sentences. I will ask you to break those sentences down so that the average reader can understand what you're saying. But there again, that's a generalization to say that that there's much marginalization going on and oppression of children going on. We may all believe that's a fact, but like I said a moment ago, we can't just put down something because we believe it's just general knowledge. There would have to be some kind of statistics, and this person did begin to give some statistical information from some UN studies to get into this issue, and that was fine. But I'm just kind of using this idea here is that you could not just state these kinds of claims without some very substantial documentation and evidence. And again, that you're kind of involved right now, you know, well, you're doing the context chapter this week, and even there, when you make claims about, you know, the demographics of a particular place or the current situation, I realize at this point you've not done a whole lot of literature research, but you might want to even just so you'll know, maybe if you do an APA, you may just put a parentheses there and just put reference. So you'll know you're going to need to reference that in some way if you've not actually, you know, found something yet. But again, when you're doing the problem statement, the purpose statement, the context, I'm looking for this kind of critical thinking, reasoning process to be demonstrated in your writing. And like I've already said, we're not all accustomed to that very exact kind of writing. But hopefully, as you work at this, even through these weeks that we're involved here and whatever comments I can give, you at least begin to get a little bit of a sense of what that kind of critical thinking writing involves. Okay, let's see. Don't want to spend too much more time on these. I don't think so. I won't give you any more examples because I want to get through the material. Let's see. This is an argument template. I didn't put this particular book on the reading list. You might want to get it though, because I have it, and it's a fairly nice book that I've run across. It's called They Say, I Say. I show it down there at the bottom. These authors have put together a series of templates with, you know, in terms of to help people write. And like I put up there, you know, research papers are not sermons, etc. They're not just a set of facts about a topic. We're supposed to be showing that we're working in a critical thinking kind of way. Example of a template that comes from these authors' books. She argues that, and you would say, you know, what this person argues. You know, we said a moment ago, you know, that Russian emancipation of peasants was an empty gesture. Okay, that's say this author's arguing that, and I agree because, and we had the reason back there before, because most of the quality of life of these peasants did not change. Her argument that this emancipation did not really produce the kind of results desired is supported by new research that says most peasant families did not get an improvement of their quality of life. And on that, you know, we cite Smith, as I did a moment ago, 2002, and what Smith says about that. So, you know, that kind of just puts it in a general format, but as you're writing, think about that kind of a template in your mind. You know, you're talking about what an author has said. You may or may not agree with it. You analyze it. You say, why do I not you agree? You provide possibly some supporting evidence for your viewpoint or why you oppose that viewpoint, and then you move on to make another claim or deal with the opinions of another author. And you might do that, say in a literature review. You might do some of that kind of thinking. You may do some of that, within the context chapter. Maybe not quite so much in the context chapter, because the context chapter is a place that you're mainly just kind of giving background. And it probably wouldn't, generally you would not necessarily have just a whole lot of agreeing and disagreeing authors. You may, because even when I call it revisionist history, even some of our history books, revise history, and you'll get a very different perspective on a particular historical event depending on who you read on that particular issue. You can pull this out of Wayne Booth, just how to evaluate sources, and I won't go through that in a detailed way right now, but make sure there's reputable publishers, they're peer-reviewed, reputable authors. Check out the sponsors of website. Sometimes people think if it's quoted on the web, they can just use that as supporting evidence. Well, not necessarily, because you can prove just about anything from the web, all right? And so look at Wayne Booth's sources, evaluation of sources. He has a whole section on that, and he expands each one of those points a little more so that you get an idea what he meaning by that. Let me just kind of conclude this set of PowerPoints with just some comments on Wikipedia. Wikipedia has been, of course, has been around for the last, 10, 15 years? We have a BGU statement on Wikipedia, and you can read it in the final project handbook, but it's something to the effect that we do allow Wikipedia, quotes, but not for statistics, and not necessarily for all the historical information. What we actually ask you to possibly use Wikipedia for is, I noticed under number 3 down there, some valid uses. You might want to read articles in Wikipedia on your particular topic, and that's fine. But to use Wikipedia as a primary source is really not valid in academia. A lot of universities will not even allow the citing of Wikipedia. We've wrestled with that. We've wrestled with it with a few people who really are good at using Wikipedia. And so that's where we finally came out to a point that we will allow it in citations on papers and final projects. But read the statement there in the BGU final project handbook to kind of make sure what you see there. Authors of those articles in Wikipedia are not necessarily experts on their topics. And of course, anyone can add or change the content of a Wikipedia audio. It's an open source, as we call application, encyclopedia. There is a review board, okay? But again, and most of those articles are fairly accurate. And I think they're getting more so. But, there is somewhat of a stigma, a hesitation in academia to see a whole lot of Wikipedia citations in a dissertation. The founder, Jimmy Wales, even says college students should not use Wikipedia for serious research. And again, I did put down a few valid sources. I just mentioned, reading articles on your topic to get a broad overview of what's going on there. Another more helpful activity, I think, for a dissertation project would be to look at the references at the bottom of a Wikipedia article. There will be leads there to other sources. And generally, there's even links that you can click on that will take you to those other sources. And so again, it's a good, possibly a good way to get directed toward other kinds of sources. So that is one possibility. There's two other components in Wikipedia that I've not even seen until I kind of read this article on a guide to using Wikipedia. And there's something called wiki projects, and those are projects that are created by joint efforts on a particular topic. And so there'll be several compilations of material on a particular topic that has been scrutinized by a joint group of editors. Of course, there again in Wikipedia, most of the work is done on a voluntary basis. Okay, so that's probably one of the problems that some people see. But these projects seem to be a little more in-depth study of a particular topic. There's also something called a wiki reference desk on Wikipedia, and again, there are indexes that provide more leads to sources. So that's one source guide, Wikipedia. Like I said, not really. I'm going to ask you to not be quoting a whole lot from Wikipedia unless you're just kind of looking for kind of a general overview that Wikipedia states well, of your particular topic. But when you get into a lot of the details, you got to be really careful with Wikipedia. I usually ask a student, okay, this information is most likely right, but I'd like you to go to some of the sources that were behind that particular article and confirm them, and then quote those other sources that Wikipedia is quoting. That at least gets you a little closer to what we call primary sources as opposed to secondary sources. So in your work next week, in the document that I generally put together as a description for the lesson, I direct you to a lot of sources to find leads, or I direct you to places like ProQuest, which is a huge index of sources and actual articles from government sources, from journals, from just a whole host of article focused sources. So ProQuest, I'll give you a little practice in using ProQuest next week. But here, Wikipedia, again, is I didn't actually mention Wikipedia then because I've just started doing some more thinking on that myself. So it's not actually in the description next week of the lesson, but make sure you remember how to use Wikipedia. And again, you've got this little section in your notes that I distributed to you. Any questions or thoughts on that? A lot of stuff to take in, I know, and some of it you just have to kind of go digest.
I wanted to mention that I got a little bit bogged down when I was trying ProQuest last week, just trying to look for some sources. I was having a very hard time finding stuff because it's there's so many search parameters and trying to think, which one should I find the keywords? Is it title? Is it subject? Is it all body? I do one search and get 19,000.
You're right. I know.
Do another search and got 3 immigration lawyers in town, and so.
Wow.
And so I was wondering, is there would a research librarian or something like that be able to help somebody? Because I just found myself just getting bogged down, and I was more successful on Google than I was on ProQuest.
Yeah.
Which I know has its own risks.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I've run into the same kind of issue. Next week, what I suggest next week is that when you're writing your literature review, you're gonna organize that literature review according to at least 3 subheadings, and those are kind of subtopics that relate to your particular main problem statement, main topic. If you can try to create some subtopics that tend to focus on certain aspects of the topic. And sometimes you can, narrow that topic down. Say you're using the term servant leadership, if you enter the word, and I think that's the illustration I use. If you enter servant leadership, you're probably now, because servant leadership has become a very prominent topic, both in business circles and academic circles. You'll probably get, many thousands of sources coming back. But if you say, compare servant leadership and transformational leadership, there you would limit your search by, it's going to bring up articles that do those kinds of comparative studies. If I say servant leadership in relationship to church leadership, or medical practice, or relate servant leadership to some particular arena, sector, then you can start to limit the number of leads to sources that come up. And that seems to be, the secret is to keep trying to limit, put qualifiers on other words, because, once you add the other words, and you can, of course, in ProQuest, you can say, use all these words, use this exact phrase, and that's, a possibility with ProQuest. Like I said, Wikipedia has these reference lists. We also use a site called google.books.com. And I think I put that in the index. I'll have to make sure. But, we use that particular site, my wife Roxy and I, when we're looking at dissertations, because we can actually pull plagiarism out of dissertations, because there you can actually enter a phrase or a part of a sentence, and you enter it into Google Books, enter that phrase, and it'll tell you if that phrase, that exact phrase, appears in other sources. And if the student, say, for example, has put that whole sentence down and has not put quotation marks around it and given adequate, adequate documentation, then we say that's plagiarism. You could also use, though, that Google Books to find sources, because you can enter keywords, and there again you can say, the search should include all these words, the words in this exact order, or any of these words. And so, google.books.com is another source engine that you could utilize in that way. Actually, Roxy, my wife just gave me that, so I'll make sure I give you that. It's I said it wrong. I said it backwards. It's actually books.google.com/advanced_book_search. And I'll put that in there so that we have that. All right, let's keep going here a bit. We've kind of talked about, let me just give you a little bit of overview on the literature review chapter. You're providing an overview of sources related to the project. You're showing your familiarity with major relevant sources. You discuss sources that help develop the context of the chapter. You explore theological themes for biblical theological chapter. You discuss how others have approached the problem and how your particular approach to the problem compares. So, those are some of the ideas that you're trying to communicate in a literature review chapter. One thing I try to make clear to students, and too often I see this, that people will put down a topic in a literature review chapter, but then they'll kind of give me a sermon or a teaching on that. And that's not the purpose. This is the literature review chapter is not the place that you're kind of giving a lot of your own opinions, okay? You're giving that doesn't mean you're not analyzing or giving some summary of a source, but you cite a source. John Smith, 2002, has written on the topic of servant leadership as compared to transformational leadership. The author provides 12 distinguishing characteristics of each of these concepts and brings them together into an integrated article that is very helpful for my particular project on transformational leadership. I may say I disagree with Smith on XYZ, but he has provided very good discussion on this particular issue. Again, like what I found, though, sometimes people use a literature review to begin giving me their whole theology and philosophy of life, and this isn't the place to do that. The focus needs to be on the sources, and then you're commenting on those sources, giving some analysis, and coming to a conclusion, and then telling how that source relates to your own project. Create at least 3 topical themes related to your topic. Oh, by the way, don't use source titles of books, articles as subheadings. The idea is to put forth a topical heading, and then you relate 3 sources that you found that seem to relate, that you think will give you some good information on that particular topic. And again, you discuss the 3 sources. You summarize the author's content, you specifically relate it to relevant content, how it's relevant to your topic, show how you're going to use that source to develop your project. Okay, and then you maybe end your chapter, literature, with a section that summarizes some of the conclusions and major insights that you've gleaned from the sources that you've at least talked about in the literature review. That's just a thumbnail sketch of what a literature review chapter might look like. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to spend too much more time on that. You will have a fairly extensive description paper on the literature review, and I encourage you to read that. The week after next, we're just kind of covering in a thumbnail sketch right now, just these next 2 chapters you're going to be dealing with. You're going to be dealing with a biblical theological chapter. And again, we're a Christian school, and therefore we ask our students to provide some kind of a biblical theological foundation for the topic and the work that they're doing on a particular topic. What you're doing that'll be chapter 4 of the proposal. And again, you're going to divide this again up into, a few sections. And it's not that long a chapter in the proposal. When you get to the actual dissertation, it'll of course be a much longer chapter. But what you're trying to do in this, both in the proposal chapter and the actual dissertation chapter, is you're trying to determine biblical wisdom that's related to your topic. And you'll develop theological themes that are related to your topic. And then you're going to, what we call, exegete some text. You may select one major text and then find major themes within that text. I've talked using the term, servant leadership. I can find, a passage in Scripture, probably both in Matthew and Luke, in those 2 synoptic gospels, where Jesus will talk about servanthood. You've heard it said that, the Gentiles lord it over such and such, but I say to you, he who would be a true leader is one who, serves and does those things. So, you may find some good content, and there may be 3 themes that you'll find in that particular passage that Jesus is talking to his disciples, or you may find 3 other distinct texts that you would like to use that seem to relate somehow to your particular work. There's a proverb, train up a child in the way he should go, and then when he is old, he will not depart from it. Okay. Again, that's one of the scriptures that was being used in a dissertation I was talking about earlier on working with children holistically. And she exegeted that passage and came up with what that passage seems to mean and how it might be applied to her particular dissertation topic. Let's see. I just said, use at least 3 sources for each theme. So, if you have a chapter that has 3 subtopics divided into 3 subheadings, I would want to see, right, at least for your proposal, at least 3 sources that you've looked at. Doesn't mean you've looked at them thoroughly at the proposal stage, but you've at least got an idea what that source is about, and you can maybe give a paragraph on how. I'm sorry, I started going back to the literature review. In the theology chapter, each section is not just your opinion or commentary on the text, okay? In the proposal, you're going to say, I'm going to deal with Matthew 9:25 through 30, and which deals with servant leadership. Don't quote me on that because that's not the exact chapter in Matthew. We need to go look that up. And then I would want to say, this topic seems to relate to my dissertation on servant leadership because, Jesus gives a definition of what it means in terms of not being a lording over kind of leader, etc. I might then say, according to John Smith, 2002, And then I might give some of the theological thoughts from John Smith that relate to that servant leadership theme and that particular subtopic in that theme. But I'm going to do that with at least 3 sources. So for each theological theme, I'm going to bring in at least 3 sources. Now, it may be at the proposal level that you've not done a lot of reading in those sources. You may just say, I plan to use, John Smith, 2003, Mary Jones, 2004, and somebody else to develop this particular subtopic for my theology chapter. And then you'd go on to the next sub-theme, and you would kind of maybe give a text that relates to it, summarize that theme, how it relates to what you're trying to accomplish, and then you would just cite or even indicate that you're going to use X, Y, Z sources, authors, to develop this particular theme for my dissertation. When you're exegeting, we use that term in biblical study, there are some common processes that are used. One of the things we've come to realize in BGU lately is that, as we brought in the DTL degree, those of you who are in a DTL degree don't necessarily have a lot of systematic theology in your educational background. And so you may not even have learned how to do a formal exegesis. And so we're not really expecting the kind of formal exegesis that you might find in a very scholarly exegetical work, if you don't have that kind of background. But what we do want to do, say you're looking at this Matthew chapter, we want to at least give who's the author of that text, Matthew, to whom was it addressed, can you come up with any of the historical and cultural background, of when, say, that servant leader discourse was given by Jesus, when he talked about Gentiles lording it over? What did that mean? You might give a little background in terms of what kinds of leadership were considered good leadership of the time. Give the immediate context of the text. Was Jesus doing this in the Sermon on the Mount? Where was Jesus giving this? What does the text say about your specific topic? Give definitions of words or phrases and need analysis within the historical culture. Like I say, a servant. You might want, and Jesus uses that term servant. And again, you might want to give some historical background on that term servant, on what a servant, what that term meant. You might go and find a lexicon that kind of gives you the Greek word, which is diakonos, I think, where we get the word deacon. And we would maybe talk about that word and what a servant does. And there again, we might want to then begin to relate that to what we're trying to talk about in terms of servant leadership. And then application, how are some of the divine principles that you glean from that text, how are they applicable to life today, and specifically life in terms of the kind of topic that you're addressing? Okay, I kind of go over a lot of this again over in the week that you'll deal with this. So I don't expect you to just pick this all up right now, but I want to kind of just give you an idea. What's the expectation in the literature review chapter and in the biblical theological chapter? Like I said, you're already working on the context chapter, and there again, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Again, just make sure you document. Put in citations of other authors and statistics as much as you can at this point. Again, fully realizing that you've not done a lot of research at this point, and sometimes you may just need to put in a parenthesis and put in reference to remind yourself that I'm going to have to come up with some kind of a documenting reference in my writing, whether I'm in the context chapter or the literature review chapter or in the theology chapter. Wow, I've given you a lot today, I know. But again, in this session, my main purpose was just to kind of at least give you a verbal idea of what the next few weeks are going to be looking like. Let's see, my screen says your screen sharing is paused. I didn't know that, but I will just take myself out of there.
Oh, I thought you were done with the PowerPoint, so I assumed that was intentional.
Maybe it was. Maybe I did that accidentally. let's, we've kind of gotten through most of our time, but I'm willing to take a few quick questions just on all that content if you've got something you'd like to put forth. Or you may be so overwhelmed at this point, you have to digest it all for a while, and that's fine too. Okay, if there's no immediate questions, I think we'll go ahead and close up the Zoom room at this point, just because we're pretty much getting to the end of the time that I had allotted for this particular application. There again, I will start giving you feedback to your discussion questions, to how you're answering them. At least a cursory look to me like most of you were actively involved in the discussions. You're giving reasonable thinking to the original question, and you are giving feedback to other students, which is also a criteria that we look at when we're looking at discussions, that you are giving helpful comments to others, not just, hey John, I really like what you said. You can say, hey John, I really like what you said, especially the part about such and such, and then you may make a comment about that. And that's kind of the appropriate way to be working within your discussions. And hopefully the smaller groups are working well for you. I've given you feedback on your problem statement, and I'll be working on the purpose statement. I'll work on that today, try to get some feedback back to you between today and tomorrow, so that you can at least have the problem and purpose statements so that you've gotten started. And then again, you're working on the context, and I'll give you feedback on that next week. I do realize, and I'm sure you're realizing that this is like a 9-week course, and we get through a lot of material in terms of writing a dissertation proposal in a very short period of time. So I'm definitely not expecting perfection. Hopefully the beauty of the course is that you're trying to work on a part of that proposal, and then I can give you feedback, and then as you continue to work on the proposal through the weeks, you can kind of use my feedback to do some revision of, say, your problem statement, your purpose statement, your context. Because every time I look at an assignment, I look at the comments I made to the previous section, I look at those, and then I look at your revisions and make sure that you have looked at my recommendations, and at least you've given some attempt to make revisions in the previous work based on what I've asked you to do. And then I'll try to give you more comment on whatever the current week assignment happens to be. And that's how we'll just keep proceeding through the remaining weeks. We'll just keep looking at this proposal and hopefully see that it's developing in a way that is going to be acceptable to an academic cabinet. Of course, that's one of the criteria, is that you do have to get a proposal that will be in such a form that it will be accepted by the academic cabinet. Which then, once that acceptance is in place, then you're allowed to continue on with the whole rest of the dissertation project. But there again, I do know that some of you have asked me about supervisors, and I do ask you to keep researching the faculty members there at BGU. Go on the website, remind yourself of possibly some of the faculty people you've worked with well. There again, if there's not someone that you can find, maybe there's someone else in your own community, within your own background, that would be helpful to your project. Again, like we've said, it just needs to be someone who is familiar, who has done a dissertation, a doctoral dissertation, and is familiar with the whole process. You just totally strike out, let me know, and I will try to, between myself and either Dr. Rodney Robinson Rogers, who is the DMIN director, or Dr. Gwen Dewey, who is the detail director. Between them and myself, we can sometimes make some recommendations for someone who possibly would be a good supervisor for your particular topic. But I would ask you to kind of be looking through your own coursework at BGU and looking at the website, at the faculty, to at least start your search on that supervisor before you get me too involved in there. I do take on a certain number of dissertations that I feel like I maybe have some expertise in, and that's fine too. But all of our faculty do that sort of thing. They will take on dissertation topics that they feel like they can provide some good input to in some way. All right, thank you for joining us today. And again, if you have emails or questions, feel free to send me an email and I'll be available. So I'm going to sign off now. I think I'm going to have an extended conversation with one person, Yvonne. I said I would go ahead and meet with you for a few minutes, but everybody else can go ahead and sign out. And again, look forward to interacting with you on the course. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Yvonne, are you with me?
I'm here with you. I'm here with you. Just waiting for Anthony to leave or
Okay.
to take him down. Maybe he's left without signing out.
Let's see. I can take him out. All right, we've done that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for meeting with me. This was a difficult call because I have been trying pretty hard to not have to have this conversation. But I think all things considered, especially given the fact that I am now working very hard at getting Overture in place, Overture Jamaica, and all the other issues, including a blood pressure that's not going down. I thought I had better have this conversation with you now than then. Now, the class has been extremely, let me end your recording, or can you?
Oh yeah, let me do that.
Yes, end the recording.
Look at rooms, pause.